Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. How's everyone doing? I wanted to talk about two things. One is the topic of HR in Egypt, because finally, I found good HR. And by finally, I mean finally. Um, First things first, for context. Yesterday there was a event by the Employment for Education for Employment organization, and it was some of them was for their students, others were for the public. I was one of three for the public. And they had interviews done yesterday for jobs. It's a job fair with interviews, it's kind of mock interviews. Now, first things first, EFE, kudos for the event. It was splendid. Absolutely loved it, absolutely enjoyed it, absolutely felt like the thing was just like, it was amazing. The students of EFE freaking slayed the interviews. I was observing them while they were doing the interviews. They slayed it. I was so impressed. And then comes the HR, the recruiters that were there. Absolutely professionalism. I rarely talk about positivity in Egypt because I've seen so much negative, but this was just on a whole different level. First of all, I came in with very low expectations. I was like, you know what, this is going to be one of those things. We're just going to go there. It's going to be like, I don't know, it's just going to be like normal people talking. And then after that, we're just going to have a little bit of conversation, and I'm not going to hear the end of it. I've been in so many interviews with sadly incompetent HR that the conversations tend to derive and derail from like the interview. Like they basically will go in and start asking very personal questions, and it turns from like a how can you be a fit for a job to why are you doing this, or what happened. Like I got some questions of these yesterday, but it was within the scope of the interview, and the person who got these questions, one of them, I was like, I'm just uncomfortable talking about it, and he just stopped. He was like, okay, got it, we can continue on and we can just move on. Loved the person, absolutely loved them. Here's the thing, here are the companies that just stood out, and I'm going to talk about each and every single one of them and why they stood out. One, Imtinen, their sales guy. They had a salesperson and then they had two recruiters. And the salesperson, we had a conversation about sales training and about how training is and how you're supposed to deal with customers and things like that. This person is an encyclopedia of sales. And the HR people who were in the HR, they just knew what they were talking about. They started asking me questions that only if you have studied HR and updated your information, you would know what you're talking about. Otherwise, it's just if you pretend that you know HR, you are in for a surprise, and a bad one. They asked about questions. There's some of them I was like, oh, I know about this one. Other ones I was like, no, I don't. And then they would explain, and I was like, oh. And the other company, speaking of like HR and terminologies, was Mikaro. The guy asked me some questions regarding HR, and I just sat down and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Even though I have read HR, even though I have tried my best to update my information, I stood there, I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he was like, oh, this, and he started explaining it to me. And I was like, oh, this is actually, I've never knew that. And I actually, after I left the event, I actually came back home and actually started reading more about it. And I was like, it was about something called EVP, Employment Value Proposition. And I was like, I've never heard of that. And then when I started reading about it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And he explained it to me what it was. And it's just, I was so impressed. And that's for Mikaro. again, empty in, awesome. Next company that I had a blast because I could tell the culture was just over the top and fun was iSchool. Now, iSchool had three people, and they had one person who was like doing the pictures, one person who was two people, the two ladies were just doing the interviews and talking to people. And the conversation between them, first of all, they know what they're talking about. Second of all, it was very professional. Third of all, at one point in time, I started getting very nervous because it's just the way the event is set up for like a set amount of time, and then you have to move forward. So it was 10 minutes, and in my head, I knew we passed the 10 minutes, so I started getting very nervous. I'm like, okay, I enjoy the fact I'm glad that we're talking, but I have to put into consideration that there are other people who want to talk to them. And she caught on quickly with this nervousness. She goes like, why are you nervous? And I'm like, well, we passed the 10 minutes. And she goes like, so we can have our conversation, finish our conversation. And then of course, if there is any chances, we'll have another conversation with you. And I would just, I enjoyed it. And not like maybe one or two companies, basically they it was obviously that they were forced to come because the entire time they were looking at their laptops and they were just like tick, 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 tick on their laptops, and I'm like, in my head I'm like, I'm not gonna bother them. And another one was just they've had it. It was obviously that they've had it. It was a company, and I started listening to how they talk to the employees, and part of me wanted to go and interview with them just to like showcase and show off a little bit of my knowledge, because they were talking about some stuff and I'm just sitting down going like, you're asking questions to fresh graduates that you require experience and a lot of experience to know the answer to these ones. Not only that, but you need very high critical thinking skills. And one of the things was they were talking about accounting. Now, I'm not an accountant, but they were talking about the difference between the set of rules in Egypt for financial rules in Egypt and then the set of rules in the US. While I'm not an accountant, I'm familiar with the rules because of my study. When I had to do my studies in my master's, I actually had to look at all of these laws and all of these rules, so I'm familiar with it. And this guy starts asking this person and goes like, so tell me about this certain rule. And I'm just sitting going like, no, he's not going to know what the rule is, because that law is that was a 1950 law. And the reason why it was a 1950 law, it was right before the revolution of Nasser, and the reason why they even made the rule. Okay, so here's what the law says, what that particular law was. In the event that a company decides to rewrite its accounting books in order to make itself look either like undervalue itself or overvalue itself, there is a specific rule in 1950 in the Egyptian law that prohibits that. And in the event that it is found, you can have fine up to 500 Egyptian pounds. Back then, 500 Egyptian pounds was massive. And then it got changed as the rules. Now, is there a certain rule like that in the US? Not necessarily. There is something very close, but not the same thing. Not as explicit as this. But anyways, that law actually got changed in Egypt, and it's not a big deal. It's just how it is. So this person's talking, and then this person goes off. Like the HR just went off on the person. He's like, yeah, well, how could you not know that? And I'm in my head going like, nobody will know that. Nobody will know that. And I found myself walking to them, and then I was like, I just took myself, ran, like literally just like did a 180, and I was like, I'm going the other way. I am going the other way. I'm like, it is none of my business. and I don't want to have a bad experience because the people right beside them, it was a company that I had my eyes on. I just like, I'm like, I want to be with that. I want to give the best impression with these ones, especially that I suck at it first impressions. And anyway, so that's that. So high school was amazing. Again, Amsterdam was amazing. Active, loved the guys in active. The person we started talking about HR, and then we ended up talking about shoes and how their shoes was different from the other people's shoes. And I'm like, yeah, I prefer this shoes. And he goes like, well, this shoes is much better. I'm like, yeah, but it's more expensive. And we ended up talking about that. Then we had Aspire HR. Lovely ladies. One of them had a twin, and we just talked about her twins. We talked a little bit about HR, and then we started talking about her twins and how it's hard to be a mother and a working mother at the same time. And I was like, kudos for you for just being like a working mother. And that was Aspire. And then came Al Suwaidi. Al Suwaidi Electrical, I was nervous because first of all, they're one of the biggest companies in Egypt. I have applied to jobs in Sweden so many times. I've lost count of how many jobs I've applied to them and had no, I wasn't lucky. It wasn't meant to be. And then I had to talk with them. And in my head, I'm like, this is bad. I'm like, I don't want to come off as needy, but at the same time, this is Sweden. Their guy the person's name there and the lady's name there, they just sat down and they were the kindest and most generous people I've seen. Again, the entire day was nothing but professional HR. Very rare. It is very rare to find something like that. And overall, the experience is well. The other one that was a big surprise was a company called Muassasat Mas. Big surprise because this is a governmental situation, and I've had so many bad experiences with governmental situation. And one of the ladies were there actually was well traveled. So as I was talking, she goes like, yeah, but this situation like that I was talking about the UAE. She goes like, but I have never heard of that. That's the first time I've heard of that. And I'm like, and as she started talking about certain things that only people who have lived in the UAE would know about it. And I'm saying, well, I'm like, you've traveled there, haven't you? She goes like, I've lived there. And I'm like, I was born there. We started talking a little bit about this one, and then talked about the US, and then we talked about my education. And they caught on very quickly with the problem with the educational system here in Egypt and the educational equivalency. Because the lady looks at me, she goes like, you couldn't do the equivalency. And I was like, yes, I have been suffering for about 7 years, going on to 7 years trying to get that done. And every single time it gets rejected and then she continues the sentence. She goes like, because your bachelor's and your master's are two different departments. Not only that, but even your two bachelors are two different departments. So according to Egyptian education, you have to have one pipeline. So if you're, let's say, you're business, then it's all business all around. If you're poli-sci or economics, then it's poli-sci and economics all the way. You can't have business and then poli-sci. And she was like, why did you have that? And I'm like, well, because of 1, 2, 3. And she goes like, whoever gave you that advice really did not put into consideration that you were coming back to Egypt. I'm like, I didn't put into consideration I was coming back to Egypt. And she was like, so why did you come back to Egypt? And I'm like, well, I'm Egyptian, so this is supposed to be home, and I'm supposed to come back home. And plus my parents that are here. So it was one of those conversations, was a very eye-opening conversation. And again, these people were beyond great. So high school was amazing, Imtinan was amazing, Active was amazing, B was just sweethearts. B was a lot like B and B Gym and B were just sweethearts. They knew how the commonality between them is professionalism. The commonality between them is they're sweethearts. They're able to do the conversation and get out all the information from you without making you feel like you are either below them or like you're above them. At one point in time, one of the conversations that was with me during like the mock interview, and the guy started asking about the education, which is something that turns out a lot. And he goes like, so we were talking about marketing, and he goes like, so basically sales, and I'm like, and I went off. I was like, marketing and sales are two different things. And he just like goes like, stop right there before you just go on a rant. And I'm like, I'm very sorry. He goes like, no, actually that's the reaction I was looking for. Because if somebody tells me that they're sales, I was the one who's gonna go on a rant. And I'm like, well, because I'm like, yeah, because Egypt has the impression that marketing and sales are one and the same. And he goes like, it is not one and the same. I'm like, yeah, it's not. I'm like, marketing is kind of like the mastermind, and sales is kind of like the muscles. And he was like, that's part of it. There's a lot of other part. I'm like, I have a bachelor's in marketing. I'm very biased to marketing. So that was one of the conversations. And again, Imtinan, Sprints was amazing. The lady for Sprints, she was patient. She was patient because she had one person who just fangirled over the company, and she was very patient with the person, and it was nice. Odo was another company. They had three people, but one person was, I could tell this person was higher up. I don't know if he's the HR manager, director, or even higher than that, but he kept quiet the entire time. And I could tell he was just observing as much as I was observing as well. He kept walking around doing this one. These are the companies that at the top of my head were great companies, wonderful companies. Al-Azabi was a lot of fun. And it's very rare to call an interview fun. It is very rare to say an employment job is fun, but they were fun. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of conversations we were having. And then there was MT Telecom, wonderful people. And Tagger also, again, wonderful, very professional, very wonderful, absolutely sweethearts, and absolutely enjoyed it. Again, for EFE, if you ever hear this one, kudos to you guys, because you've done a great job. iSchool, Swedi, Active, Imtihan, Aspire HR, Muassasat Masr, and every other company there. You basically you took it out of the park. You hit it out of the park. It was wonderful to see something positive, and it was just wonderful to be in there. So anyways, talk to you later. Bye bye.